Welcome back to the Sports Philosopher's Rant. Today we want to talk a little bit about the sport in Alabama that we don't talk about too much, and that's Alabama basketball. Now, any of you out there that have been following Alabama basketball for the last decade can probably be best described as being a masochist, because it has been one disaster after another on the basketball court, and it seems like coach after coach that we just cannot seem to get anything going when it comes to the basketball program. Or we'll have one game here and there that we do pretty good in, but then it's just an absolute collapse. And the first sign of any kind of opposition, typically Alabama just folds like a child when it comes to basketball. It's been really disappointing to watch for years. That being said, if you live in Tuscaloosa right now, and if you're a fan of basketball at all, you need to do yourself a favor and get out to Coleman Coliseum and watch this team and support this team, because this team is putting more fight and more effort into basketball than any team that I've seen play in that arena for years. They are really coming together under new coach Nate Oates, and they are playing harder and with more intensity than ever before. It is remarkable to watch. Even in games where their shots aren't falling and things like that, they still are either right in it at the very end or they come out and outright win. And Saturday against Missouri, for instance, they had the referees were just calling foul after foul, and it was getting ridiculous. And they just, unlike in the past teams that when that kind of thing happens, they just fall apart and lose, they actually maintained their composure and held it together and ended up winning by 14 points against a decent Missouri team. I mean, that's not a team to squawk at or anything like that. So it was really impressive to watch. And I mean, teams, especially ones that shoot a lot of 3 points, you're going to have those games where you're not hitting all your shots. That's basketball. It's what happens. So for these guys that continue to perform hard even when things aren't going their way, it's something we have not seen in Tuscaloosa for years. So it's great job by Alabama basketball for really becoming relevant again. And I'm not expecting them probably to make the tournament or anything this year, or at least if they do, they'll probably just barely get in just because of some of the early losses they've had at that, and just having a really tough schedule and being a very depleted roster. But the fact that they started the year sluggish and everything like that, it just goes to show how much over the last few weeks they're really starting to buy into the new style that they're playing. They're getting their confidence. And kudos to Coach Oates. He's really grabbed this bull by the horn and has taken ownership of it and has got these guys believing that they can win. It's awesome to watch. And he's echoed those same statements when he's had his press conferences and things like that, like after the Kentucky game and things like that, when he was asked, well, your team's not playing very good. And he said, no, they're playing really good. They're playing really hard. They weren't having a good shooting game. I mean, that kind of thing happens. But having a coach come out there and have your back like that, I mean, the players are hearing that, and it's pretty clear that they like playing for him and believe in what he's doing. And so it's great to see that happening here in Tuscaloosa. Coming up here in a few weeks, of course, we got the Super Bowl between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers. It should be a really great matchup. You've got the historically dominating offense against the rugged defense and run game type thing going on here. Of course, the media, in their obsession over high-scoring offenses, is trying to say that Mahomes is the greatest thing in the world. And sure, he's putting up incredible numbers, but looking at this from my perspective, the defensive team usually wins these kind of matchups, especially in the playoffs. Granted, the Titans did not beat them this past weekend, but the Titans also were an overmatched opponent, in my opinion, whereas the 49ers throughout the year, they've looked like the best team pretty much the whole time. I mean, you could make the case that maybe the Baltimore Ravens did, but they choked and fell apart very early in the playoffs relative to what they were expected to do. So I'm liking San Francisco to win this. I mean, they've been there a lot more recently than the Chiefs. They have more players that are used to this kind of stage than what the Chiefs have. Great defense. They got a quarterback that, while obviously not putting up the kind of numbers Mahomes is, he's a great fit for what they're doing and very efficient in that offense. They have a strong run game and all of that, and their defense just dominates games. It's great to watch. So I like San Francisco to win this. I think they will, and I'm expecting it to be an exciting game, but I think they're probably the team that's going to pull it off. Other sports news, we also have the U.S. Open that started there with tennis. And to be honest, I don't follow tennis as much as I would like to. It's one of those things I tend to follow it pretty closely once the Grand Slams start up. And it's been the same story for years now, it seems like, in tennis, where it's one of the big threes probably going to win, like what happens almost every time. And I mean, you can't really talk about men's tennis without talking about the sheer dominance that these top three guys have had for over a decade now. I mean, Roger Federer is arguably the greatest player of all time. You've got Djokovic, who's probably going to eventually surpass Federer's accomplishments as far as total Grand Slams. And you also have Rafael Nadal, who has been, without question, the greatest clay court player who ever lived. It's the fact that these guys have dominated for such a long time. It's hard to even comprehend if you look at any other era of tennis. So no surprise at all that these guys are number 1, 2, and 3 in the world, Nadal being 1, Djokovic being number 2, and Federer being number 3. Looking at this, I've got to think that most likely the favorite's got to be Djokovic, just because he is easily the unquestioned king of the hard court. He's won 7 Australian Opens. He just had remarkable success at this tournament. And unless he's injured, which, I mean, he did leave the U.S. Open with an injury, so there might be some question there as to whether or not he's 100%, even though it's been a few months now. So more than likely, he's probably good to go. I mean, if he is injured or something, or still has some lingering issues there, that might cause some concern for him. But otherwise, you got to think he's most likely the favorite. He does at number 2 in the world, though, and being the number 2 seed in the tournament, he is going to have to probably play Roger Federer unless he gets upset earlier. And what more can be said about Federer? I mean, he's still going strong. He just seems like the ageless wonder out there. The one thing that I would be cautious about with him is just at that age, it's really hard to bring your A game every single time out there. I mean, just the conditions and everything like that, and the fatigue can really get to you. Not to mention every single person that plays Federer wants to get their name in the history book as being one of the people that beat him. So it's really hard when you're getting up there in the years like he is to really come out every single time with your best, even though he's been doing it longer than anybody is, which, I mean, cannot say enough about the level of dominance he's had over his career. But, I mean, assuming that he can bring it every game, he's very much in play there. I don't know that he can beat Djokovic there. I do think if he got matched up against Nadal, he probably would be able to win. Now, the one thing Nadal has going for him is that at number 1, he gets to avoid both of those guys until the championship matchup. And Nadal's proven that he can beat everybody except for those 2 guys with relative ease. So, again, similar to Djokovic, as long as he's playing healthy, you got to think he's likely a shoo-in to get at least to the semifinals and probably to the championship match. The problem is those other 2 guys have had his number here lately. Djokovic has had his number for a long time, but Federer's really done a good job the last couple of years to really turn that rivalry around in his favor. So I think if either one of those 2 guys makes, between Djokovic and Federer, makes the championship match, whoever does will likely be the favorite to win, especially if it's Djokovic. If it's Nadal, I mean, Federer, or if it's Federer, I'm sorry, Nadal would probably have a little bit better of a chance against him, I would think, is he just seems to get beat by Djokovic pretty much every time. But I think against Federer, he might have a little bit better of an opportunity. So I'm still saying Djokovic is probably the one that's going to win this. If it was the U.S. Open, it seems like the ball usually drops Nadal's way a little bit better, but Australia has just never been the one that he seems to be able to put it away on. Like, he'll get to the championship match a lot, but then he'll usually lose it, it seems like. I don't know if it's bad luck or just the time of the year or what, but got to think Djokovic is probably the one that's going to win this one. But whoever takes it home, I mean, you cannot talk tennis without just saying what a different era it's going to be when these 3 guys are no longer around. They've been on top what seems like forever, and anytime any one of those guys does not win, it just seems like an absolute shock. I do think of the younger guys, the one that's most likely to emerge as the next guy. The next big thing is probably Medvedev from Russia. He had a great championship match against Nadal there in the U.S. Open that really could have gone either way there at the end of it, and it's really remarkable how he was able to come back with being down like he was. So I look for him to probably be that next generation guy that's going to be the next big superstar, but I don't think he's quite there yet. I think it's probably going to take one or more of these guys retiring before anybody really breaks through that barrier that they've really put in by their sheer dominance. I mean, you've had even guys over the last decade that in other eras probably would have won double-digit Grand Slams or close to that at least. Guys like Andy Murray and Stan Wawrinka, both guys that had played pretty good against those guys, and Wawrinka in particular has had a pretty good record against those guys relative to what everybody else has done against them. And even he's only managed to win 3 Grand Slam championships. So you put him in an era without those guys, and there's no telling what he probably would have been a 7 to 10 time champion or something along the lines of that. And then the same could probably be said about Andy Murray, another 3-time Grand Slam winner that probably would have been more like 7, 8, 9 or so if he had played another era. And let's not forget that before these guys, the record was, 14? I think by Pete Sampras. I mean, I think all 3 of these guys you could make a case for as being the greatest who ever played, depending on what you're using as your criteria. I think if you look at their games, that you would say Federer is probably the greatest all-around player who ever lived, and then Djokovic is maybe the most top-heavy, dominant one ever. It definitely seems to be the best at hard court that I would say that I've seen. He just dominates those hard courts, the U.S. and Australian Open when he's healthy. And Nadal is hands down the king of clay. Everybody knows he's by far the best clay court player that ever lived. The only guy that's even remotely close to him is Bjorn Borg. It's the only one. Federer, while, I mean, a lot of people like to say he's the greatest grass court player ever, I'd still say it's between him and Pete Sampras, and if you want to talk about a match that we would have all loved to have seen, it would have been prime Pete Sampras versus prime Roger Federer championship match at Wimbledon. That would have been probably the greatest match of all time by far, because the dominance that both of those guys had on grass was crazy. But Federer has clearly separated himself as the better overall player, Sampras, because Sampras could never really get it going on clay. Whereas the fact that Federer was able to play in the French Open last year and make it to the semifinals when he hadn't even played it in 3 years, I mean, that just highlights the absolute great play that Federer has given for years, that he's able, after a 3-year hiatus, to come back there and to make it all the way to the semifinals. The only reason he didn't go even farther is because he got matched up against the greatest who ever lived on the other side, in Nadal, the one place where he is never going to beat him, and Roland Garros there. We all pretty much know that, including Federer this time. But he still came out and played, and good for him for doing that. So that's what my thoughts on the Australian Open. It's most likely going to be Djokovic who comes away with that, and it's hard to see it going any other way pretty much unless he gets injured or something to that effect. Okay, that'll do it for today. Here in the upcoming days, I'm going to probably do a video on an introductory video on philosophy, just because, I mean, that's the other part of my namesake on here, and it's one of those things that's kind of fascinating. It takes a lot of time to get into, and it's got to be kind of broken down into parts, but I think I'll do a little intro on philosophy here in the upcoming days. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time.